everybody. Welcome back to A People's Historian. My name is Jason Kishneff. Each episode we read about 30 minutes of history together. We're just starting chapter 14 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, entitled War is the Health of the State. Remember, if you like what you hear, hit the like and subscribe button and hit that notification bell so that you'll be notified each time I make a new video. Shall we dig in? War is the health of the state. That's actually the title of the chapter, as well as the first sentence. War is the health of the state, the radical writer Randolph Bourne said in the midst of the First World War. Indeed, as the nations of Europe went to war in 1914, the governments flourished. Patriotism bloomed. Class struggle was stilled, and young men died in frightful numbers on the battlefields, often for 100 yards of land, a line of trenches. In the United States, not yet in the war, there was worry about the health of the state. Socialism was growing. The IWW seemed to be everywhere. Class conflict was intense. In the summer of 1916, during a Preparedness Day parade in San Francisco, a bomb exploded, killing 9 people, 2 local radicals. Tom Mooney and Warren Billings were arrested and would spend 20 years in prison. Shortly after that, Senator James Wadsworth of New York suggested compulsory military training for all males to avert the danger that these people of ours shall be divided into classes. Rather, we must let our young men know that they owe some responsibility to this country. The supreme fulfillment of that responsibility was taking place in Europe. 10 million were to die on the battlefield. 20 million were to die of hunger and disease related to the war, and no one since that day has been able to show that the war brought any gain for humanity that would be worth one human life. Think about that one for a minute. The rhetoric of the socialists, that it was an imperialist war, now seems moderate and hardly arguable. The advanced capitalist countries of Europe were fighting over boundaries, colonies, spheres of influence. They were competing for Alsace-Lorraine, the Balkans, Africa, the Middle East. The war came shortly after the opening of the 20th century in the midst of exultation, perhaps only among the elite in the Western world, about progress and modernization. One day after the English declared war, Henry James wrote to a friend, "The plunge of civilization into the abyss of blood and darkness is a thing that so gives away the whole long age during which we have supposed the world to be, gradually bettering." In the first battle of the Marne, the British and French succeeded in blocking the German advance on Paris. Each side had 500,000 casualties. You hear these numbers and you just go, 500,000 dead bodies is a lot of dead bodies. The killings started very fast and on a large scale. In August 1914, a volunteer for the British Army had to be 5 feet 8 inches to enlist. By October, the requirement was lowered to 5 feet 5 inches. That month there were 30,000 casualties, and then one could be 5 feet 3. In the first 3 months of war, almost the entire original British Army was wiped out. For 3 years, the battle lines remained virtually stationary in France. Each side would push forward, then back, then forward again, for a few yards, a few miles, while the corpses piled up. In 1916, the Germans tried to break through at Verdun. The British and French counterattacked along the Seine, moved forward a few miles, and lost 600,000 men. One day, the 9th Battalion of the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry launched an attack with 800 men. 24 hours later, there were 84 left. Back home, the British were not told of the slaughter. One English writer recalled, "The most bloody defeat in the history of Britain might occur, and our press come out bland and copious and graphic with nothing to show that we had not had quite a good day. A victory, really." The same thing was happening on the German side, as Erich Maria Remarque wrote in his great novel on days when men by the thousands were being blown apart by machine guns and shells. The official dispatches announced all quiet on the Western Front. Really great movie if you ever get a chance to see that movie about World War I. It's called All Quiet on the Western Front. In July 1916, British General Douglas Haig ordered 11 divisions of English soldiers to climb out of their trenches and move toward the German lines. The 6 German divisions opened up with their machine guns. Of the 110,000 who attacked, 20,000 were killed, 40,000 more wounded. All those bodies strewn on no man's land, the ghostly territory between the contending trenches. On January 1st, 1917, Haig was promoted to Field Marshal. What happened that summer is described tersely in William Langer's An Encyclopedia of World History. Despite the opposition of Lloyd George and the skepticism of some of his subordinates, Haig proceeded hopefully to the main offensive. The Third Battle of... I can't pronounce this word. Ypres? Ypres. Y-P-R-E-S. Ypres was a series of 8 heavy attacks, carried through in driving rain and fought over ground waterlogged and muddy. No breakthrough was effected, and the total gain was about 5 miles of territory, which made the Ypres salient more inconvenient than ever and cost the British about 400,000 men. The people of France and Britain were not told the extent of the casualties. When in the last year of the war the Germans attacked ferociously on the Somme and left 300,000 British soldiers dead or wounded, London newspapers printed the following: "We learned from Paul Fussell's The Great War in Modern Memory." What can I do? How the civilian may help in this crisis? Be cheerful. Write encouragingly to friends at the front. Don't repeat foolish gossip. Don't listen to idle rumors. Don't think you know better than Haig. Into this pit of death and deception came the United States in the spring of 1917. Mutinies were beginning to occur in the French army. Soon, out of 112 divisions, 68 would have mutinies. 629 men would be tried and condemned, 50 shot by firing squads. American troops were badly needed. President Woodrow Wilson had promised that the United States would stay neutral in the war. There is such a thing as a nation being too proud to fight. But in April of 1917, the Germans had announced they would have their submarines sink any ship bringing supplies to their enemies, and they had sunk a number of merchant vessels. Wilson now said he must stand by the right of Americans to travel on merchant ships into the war zone. "I cannot consent to any abridgment of the rights of American citizens in any respect." As Richard Hofstadter points out, this was rationalization of the flimsiest sort. The British had also been intruding on the rights of American citizens on the high seas, but Wilson was not suggesting we go to war with them. Hofstadter says Wilson was forced to find legal reasons for policies that were based not upon law but upon the balance of power and economic necessities. It was unrealistic to expect that the Germans would treat the United States as neutral in the war when the U.S. had been shipping great amounts of war materials to Germany's enemies. In early 1915, the British liner Lusitania was torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine. She sank in 18 minutes, and 1,198 people died, including 124 Americans. The United States claimed the Lusitania carried an innocent cargo, and therefore the torpedoing was a monstrous German atrocity. Actually, the Lusitania was heavily armed. It carried 1,248 cases of 3-inch shells, 4,927 boxes of cartridges, 1,000 rounds in each box, and 2,000 more cases of small arms ammunition. Her manifests were falsified to hide this fact, and the British and American governments lied about the cargo. Hofstadter wrote of economic necessities behind Wilson's war policy. In 1914, a serious recession had begun in the United States. J.P. Morgan later testified, "The war opened during a period of hard times. Business throughout the country was depressed. Farm prices were deflated. Unemployment was serious. The heavy industries were working far below capacity and bank clearings were off." But by 1915, war orders for the Allies, mostly England, had stimulated the economy, and by April 1917, more than $2 billion worth of goods had been sold to the Allies. $2 billion was a lot more money in 1917 than it is now, and it's a lot of money now. As Hofstadter says, America became bound up with the Allies in a fateful union of war and prosperity. Prosperity depended much on foreign markets. It was believed by the leaders of the country. Prosperity depended much on foreign markets, it was believed by the leaders of the country. In 1897, the private foreign investments of the United States amounted to $700 million. In 1897. By 1914, they were $3.5 billion. Wilson's Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, while a believer in neutrality in the war, also believed that the United States needed overseas markets. In May of 1914, he praised the president as one who had opened the doors of all the weaker countries to an invasion of American capital and American enterprise. Back in 1907, Woodrow Wilson had said in a lecture at Columbia University, "Concessions obtained by financiers must be safeguarded by ministers of state, even if the sovereignty of unwilling nations be outraged in the process. The doors of the nations which are closed must be battered down." In his 1912 campaign, he said, "Our domestic markets no longer suffice. We need foreign markets." In a memo to Bryan, he described his aim as an open door to the world. And in 1914, he said he supported the righteous conquest of foreign markets. So he's going to kick down the door. It's funny because, see, we're learning real history here, right? Because back in high school, I learned Woodrow Wilson was a swell guy, and I know so much more about him now that I'm a grown-up. With World War I, England became more and more a market for American goods and for loans at interest. J.P. Morgan and Company acted as agents for the Allies, and when, in 1915, Wilson lifted the ban on private bank loans to the Allies, Morgan could now begin lending money in such great amounts as to both make great profit and tie American finance closely to the interest of a British victory in the war against Germany. The industrialists and the political leaders talked of prosperity as if it were classless, as if everyone gained from Morgan's loans. True, the war meant more production, more employment, but did the workers in the steel plants gain as much as U.S. Steel, which made $348 million in profit in 1916 alone? Remember, $348 million, a lot more in 1916 than it is now, and it's a lot of money now. When the United States entered the war, it was the rich who took even more direct charge of the economy. Financier Bernard Baruch headed the War Industries Board. I'm sure that's not how you pronounce it, but I'm Jewish, and that's how it looks like it's pronounced to me. Financier Bernard Baruch headed the War Industries Board, the most powerful of the wartime government agencies. Bankers, railroad men, and industrialists dominated these agencies. A remarkably perceptive article on the nature of the First World War appeared in May 1915 in the Atlantic Monthly, written by W.E.B. Du Bois. It was titled The African Roots of War. It was a war for empire of which the struggle between Germany and the Allies over Africa was both symbol and reality. In a very real sense, Africa is a prime cause of this terrible overturning of civilization which we have lived to see. Africa, Du Bois said, is the land of the 20th century because of the gold and diamonds of South Africa, the cocoa of Angola and Nigeria, the rubber and ivory of the Congo, the palm oil of the West Coast. Du Bois saw more than that. He was writing several years before Lenin's imperialism, which noted the new possibility of giving the working class of the imperial country a share of the loot. He pointed to the paradox of greater democracy in America alongside increased aristocracy and hatred toward darker races. He explains the paradox by the fact that the white working man has been asked to share the spoil of exploiting chinks and N-words. Sorry. Yes, the average citizen of England, France, Germany, the United States had a higher standard of living than before, but whence comes this new wealth? It comes primarily from the darker nations of the world, Asia and Africa, South and Central America, the West Indies, and the islands of the South Seas. Du Bois saw the ingenuity of capitalism in uniting exploiter and exploited, creating a safety valve for explosive class conflict. It is no longer simply the merchant prince or the aristocratic monopoly or even the employing class that is exploiting the world. It is the nation, a new democratic nation composed of united capital and labor. The United States fitted that idea of Du Bois. American capitalism needed international rivalry and periodic war to create an artificial community of interest between rich and poor, supplanting the genuine community of interest among the poor that showed itself in sporadic movements. How conscious of this were individual entrepreneurs and statesmen? That's hard to know. But their actions, even if half-conscious, instinctive drives to survive matched such a scheme, and in 1917 this demanded a national consensus for war. The government quickly succeeded in creating such a consensus, according to the traditional histories. Woodrow Wilson's biographer Arthur Link wrote, in the final analysis, American policy was determined by the president and public opinion. In fact, there is no way of measuring public opinion at that time, and there is no persuasive evidence that the public wanted war. The government had to work hard to create its consensus. That there was no spontaneous urge to fight is suggested by the strong measures taken. A draft of young men, an elaborate propaganda campaign throughout the country, and harsh punishment for those who refused to get in line. Despite the rousing words of Wilson about a war to end all wars, and to make the world safe for democracy, Americans did not rush to enlist. 1 million men were needed, but in the first 6 weeks after the declaration of war, only 73,000 volunteered. Congress voted overwhelmingly for a draft. George Creel, a veteran newspaperman, became the government's official propagandist for the war. He set up a committee on public information to persuade Americans the war was right. It sponsored 75,000 speakers who gave 750,000 four-minute speeches in 5,000 American cities and towns. It was a massive effort to excite a reluctant public. At the beginning of 1917, a member of the National Civic Federation had complained that neither working men nor farmers were taking any part or interest in the efforts of the security or defense leagues or other movements for national preparedness. The day after Congress declared war, the Socialist Party met in emergency convention in St. Louis and called the declaration a crime against the people of the United States. In the summer of 1917, socialist anti-war meetings in Minnesota drew large crowds, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 farmers protesting the war, the draft, profiteering. A local newspaper in Wisconsin, the Plymouth Review, said that probably no party ever gained more rapidly in strength than the Socialist Party just at that present time. It reported that thousands assembled to hear socialist speakers in places where ordinarily a few hundred are considered large assemblages. The Akron Beacon Journal, a conservative newspaper in Ohio, said there was scarcely a political observer, but what will admit that were an election to come now, a mighty tide of socialism would inundate the Middle West. It said the country had never embarked upon a more unpopular war. Did you know that? How unpopular World War I was? In the municipal elections of 1917, against the tide of propaganda and patriotism, the socialists made remarkable gains. Their candidate for mayor of New York, Morris Hillquit, got 22% of the vote, 5 times the normal socialist vote there. 10 socialists were elected to the New York State Legislature. In Chicago, the party vote went from 3.6% in 1915 to 34.7% in 1917. In Buffalo, it went from 2.6% to 30.2%. If you did not know that World War I was super unpopular, put it in the comments. I guess if you did know, you can put that in the comments too. Tell the truth now. George Creel and the government were behind the formation of an American Alliance for Labor and Democracy, whose president was Samuel Gompers and whose aim was to unify sentiment in the nation for the war. There were branches in 164 cities. Many labor leaders went along. According to James Weinstein, however, the alliance did not work. Rank-and-file working-class support for the war remained lukewarm, and although some prominent socialists, Jack London, Upton Sinclair, Clarence Darrow, became pro-war after the U.S. entered, most socialists continued their opposition. Congress passed and Wilson signed in June of 1917 the Espionage Act. From its title, one would suppose it was an act against spying. However, it had a clause that provided penalties up to 20 years in prison for whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the U.S. That is a long sentence. Unless one had a theory about the nature of governments, it was not clear how the Espionage Act would be used. It certainly wasn't clear that we'd be using it on whistleblowers in the 21st century. It even had a clause that said, "Nothing in this section shall be construed to limit or restrict any discussion, comment, or criticism of the acts or policies of the government." But its double talk concealed a singleness of purpose. The Espionage Act was used to imprison Americans who spoke or wrote against the war. 2 months after the law passed, a socialist named Charles Schenck was arrested in Philadelphia for printing and distributing 15,000 leaflets that denounced the draft law and the war. The leaflet recited the 13th Amendment provision against involuntary servitude and said the Conscription Act violated this. Conscription, it said, was a monstrous deed against humanity in the interests of the financiers of Wall Street, and do not submit to intimidation. Schenck was indicted, tried, found guilty, and sentenced to 6 months in jail for violating the Espionage Act. It turned out to be one of the shortest sentences given in such cases. Schenck appealed, arguing that the act, by prosecuting speech and writing, violated the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. The Supreme Court's decision was unanimous and was written by its most famous liberal, Oliver Wendell Holmes. He summarized the contents of the leaflet and said it was undoubtedly intended to obstruct the carrying out of the draft law. Was Schenck protected by the First Amendment? Holmes said, "The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent." Holmes's analogy was clever and attractive. Few people would think free speech should be conferred on someone shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic, but did that example fit criticism of the war? Zachariah Chpt, a Harvard Law School professor, wrote later that a more apt analogy for Schenck was someone getting up between the acts of a theater and declaring that there were not enough fire exits. To play further with the example, was not Schenck's act more like someone shouting, not falsely but truly, to people about to buy tickets and enter a theater that there was a fire raging inside? Perhaps free speech could not be tolerated by any reasonable person if it constituted a clear and present danger to life and liberty. After all, free speech must compete with other vital rights. But was not the war itself a clear and present danger? Indeed, more clear and more present and more dangerous to life than any argument against it? Did citizens not have a right to object to war? A right to be a danger to dangerous policies? I'm going to call that the end of the episode. I do hope you'll tune into the next one. Thank you so much for joining me. Be sure to hit the like and subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.